Welcome back to the Rodev Shalom Pursuing Peace in Judaism course. I am Daniel Roth, Director of the Pardes Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution. And I'm joined once again by Rabbi Dr. Mark Gopin, Director of the Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. This is our final session of this course, and we're going to take a good look at ethical dilemmas that come up in Redifat Shalom, in pursuing peace and peacemaking, which is something we haven't really explored up until now. We talked about some of the problems of applying certain methods in certain instances, but here we're going to talk about specifically two kind of questions that we'll see connect. And the conversation gets started with something that we talked about a lot at different moments of our conversation, which is about the importance of humility, of the Rodev Shalom. We have this first source in Kala Rapati, 6th century, that talks about how Aaron, that it's like the example of someone of lowly spirit, shpelut ruach, someone who's humble, is a peacemaker. And a peacemaker can only be successful if they're really, truly of lowly spirit. Because they talk about how both in the interpersonal connection, that somebody who fights with them, sometimes they're silent, which we talked about. If someone curses them, sometimes they'll just say, peace be upon you. It's this tremendous sense of self-control and inner strength and inner peace. But also just by entering into a conflict. Especially imagining Aaron, the high priest, the president of the whole people, let's say, going into two people's petty conflict and sitting down and saying, let's talk about this. It's just, and you talk about this in your book, End in Armageddon, about the more respected the third party is, the more of a message of humility it's sending to the two parties to say, join me in lowering our spirit and being able to kind of talk about this without having to feel like, I'm more important than you are, and my needs are more important than yours are. And this is something that we see not only in the Jewish texts, but we brought a few texts here from other cultures. Well, this quote from Elias Jauber of the Sulcha, where he talks about the importance of how distinguished the third-party peacemaker is, and at the same time, sometimes they have to be, anger absorber, that people might be angry with them, and have to have that humility and that sense of self strength and integrity to kind of allow for people to express that and to help encourage them to lower their spirit.
This is a big part of my odyssey and journey and trying to figure things out since I was very young, because my PhD work was on ethics, on religious ethics, and I've been exploring and experimenting with this for a long time. And I was struck many years ago of the end of the davening, the end of the Amidah, the Jewish standing prayer, is this extra portion that says "V'nafshi ke'afar lakol tihiyeh." And I hope that my spirit can be as dust before everyone, which is a very radical statement, and in some ways problematic from the point of view of a typical notion of positive sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
So what's going on there? And at the same time that I was really looking at that text, I was reading and rereading Gandhi's autobiography, where he called My Experiments with the Truth, where he says exactly the same thing, where he says that you cannot be a peacemaker unless you make yourself the dust of the earth. The same language. I was really astonished by that.
In regard to being a peacemaker.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is also, when it comes to the ethics of peacemaking, and I write a lot in To Make the Earth Whole, I explore the ethics of this field, ethical dilemmas of this field, because the professionalization of conflict resolution doesn't like to talk about it as an ethical vocation. Mm-hmm. But in fact, it is an ethical vocation, and it's filled with ethical dilemmas.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, you have to sort of think, of different schools of thought on what is ethics. Is ethics about your outcomes, or is ethics about your way of being, or is ethics about, in a Kantian sense, the act? Is it right or is it wrong? There's like 3 different schools. And when somebody lowers themselves, and the story is actually, Aaron's not sitting with 2 people, he actually does shuttle diplomacy. So he goes and he listens to this one, and the person's swearing up and down about this other guy, and he's just listening and listening. Yeah, I understand that. And then he goes over to the other one, and he says, I did sense that he felt a little bad, but let me hear your side. And that, so shuttle diplomacy itself is a little bit demeaning, because usually the great leader, everyone comes to them. You think of the king, Solomon is deciding between 2 people before him, and no, the Aaronic model, the Aaron model, is the opposite. This distinguished person is going here, then he's going over there, he's hearing everybody yell, he's going back and forth. What is that? Is it a strategic thing, a utilitarian ethical act, where you're lowering yourself for the outcome? Is it in order to teach them something? Or is it something else? Is it a way of being in order to take your ego out of your consciousness just for a bit, in order to even comprehend the conflict? That you can't even begin to comprehend conflicts as long as your ego is too large, as long as and not only ego in the bad sense, but your whole identity. So many times in my life, I've had to take my Jewish identity, put it over here, in order to really embrace where these people are at. But then I bring it right back, because that is my identity.
Right.
And that process is to me, it's a spiritual experience. It's not just a strategic thing, it's also a spiritual experience, a fulfillment of that text in the Amidah, and a kind of a new consciousness. And in Jewish mysticism, Hasidic mysticism, that is the attachment to God. The abnegation of self, the ayin, the achievement of nothing, is the achievement of union with the divine. So there's something very profound going on here that's both strategic and utilitarian, but it also is spiritual in a deeper sense of where ethics meets a kind of spiritual fulfillment. So there's a lot more in these texts that I think that meets the eye.
There's just so many quick associations. I think of a source that I didn't bring here that I should have brought here. One of the sources from the Musar literature that's kind of encouraging ethical behavior, the Paleo Etz, that talks about how the importance of humility in interpersonal conflict resolution. That so often conflicts get stuck, like we saw with that Reb Chaim Volozhin source beforehand. That everyone says, "Why should I lower my spirit?"
Right.
I've been wronged. You're the one who's supposed to lower your spirit. And he said it's so rare to find that God-fearing person. And I specifically want to use that language of God-fearing because a sense that something's greater, that something that's whole, that's supposed to be uniting us, and then recognize, I want to lower myself first. And here we see Aaron as a third-party person being that role model. But that's not the only one where we see a third party being a role model of humility. And you talk about this again in your book with Ed and Armageddon. We're not going to deal with this story of Remeir at great length. I'll make just as a side note, I write about this extensively in my doctorate, so please God, it should be published, and people can see all the literary angles and literature about what's been said about it. But the dilemma that comes up from the Rebbe Meir story is that here you have a very involved third party who actually is part of the root cause of the conflict between the husband and wife. He's not an outside third party like Aaron is. And you have this husband who's kind of abusive to the wife, setting these very tall demands. And Remeir just seems to be, in one way or another, succumbing to that, appeasing the husband, and saying, this is an act of humility in order to allow for peacemaking. But then in the narrative, you have the students of Remeir who are saying, what are you talking about? You want to make peace with that husband and wife, take the guy out, and how do they say? Flog him. Give him a good whipping.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And then then you'll make peace between the two of them. And,
Yeah.
and I think what's interesting is that we're kind of left with two perhaps extreme models in that story. And it's not only in this story, it's the dilemma, which is on the one hand you have Rabbi Meir, who is humility, quiet, humble, superhuman. He's letting her spit 7 times in his eye, more than even the husband had asked. And he's saying, I'm acting like God did when he would allow his name to be blotted out. On the other hand, you have the students who are saying, but you're allowing for this social imbalance. You're perpetuating that social imbalance. And they're going to keep on going like this. You're not teaching him anything. So I think here we have the beginning. It's already in this story, we're going to see with other legal texts, that perhaps sometimes this dilemma of, God, there's like an injustice here. When am I going to be a Rodev Shalom, pursuing peace and acting out of humility and role modeling? And when do you become this Rodev Tzedek?
Yeah, and
of pursuing justice.
Exactly, and Radif Tzedek is the pursuit of justice is an equally important mitzvah, commandment. It's an obligation. It's all throughout the prophets as the foundation stone of decency,
Yeah.
of legitimacy of any civilization. Is standing up for those who are weaker, in a vulnerable position, specifically widows and orphans.
Yeah.
So it's very clear that the disciples. The problem with the disciples, though, is that their solution
It's violence.
is violence, and it's I could just see them in this Jewish moment. You want peace? I'll give you a peace. I'll give you a piece of my mind. And you got that. You even have it in the Passover Seder, with the wicked son, Hake Yeshinov, knock him over the teeth, and knock some sense into him. That whole idea of knocking sense into people,
Right.
which is a very ironic expression, as if you can knock sense into people.
Right.
So the standing up for justice here and for the woman's rights, that's very clear, as a conflict in values that's very legitimate. The problem is the method.
Right.
And I face this constantly with people involved in nonviolent resistance movements. And at what point does justice demand that you fight back? At what point do you need to go over to the side of taking up arms and so on? These are very legitimate moral dilemmas. And it should be seen as a legitimate moral dilemma.
Right.
However, there should be a respect for the fact that the notion of nonviolence that Rameir is postulating isn't negating the importance of justice. It's asking, okay, we know there's justice and injustice. What now? What is your alternative? Should I just let this guy, does she get to lose her house? What should I do with her? So we don't want to go into the details too much. People will argue this as they study the text. Also, it's very important not to, how shall I say it, equate that civilization with what we have available now. There's no courts to go to that would, there's no easy solution to what to do with that husband. So that's a separate, question of what Rabbi Meir, the controversial nature of what Rabbi Meir did.
Yeah.
I just want to point out that there's another piece of this, and that is that Rabbi Meir was doing something so radically self-negating that I believe he was hoping that this would create a completely different dynamic with this barbarous husband. And that is that he's the other male here. It's very clear to me that this barbarous guy was extremely jealous of Rameir because his wife had went out and studied
You
with
have the
him.
whole Sota imagery of the wife who's cheating on her husband with the Torah scholar.
Absolutely. And it's also what we know as a very severe split between the rabbis of the time and laborers and common people who resented the rabbis. I mean, we know this from the Talmud. So we have a serious male thing going on here. And Reb Meir's solution is to radically negate himself, but it also is a kind of goad, I think, for self-reflection to the husband about his behavior.
Right.
In a way that I doubt beating the heck out of him, like Reb Meir's students wanted to do, would actually accomplish.
Right.
So these are very difficult, things that we face every day in the field where justice gives you the right to hit somebody, but then you step back and say, what next?
So we're going to get to that exact point in a moment. But what I like to do with that story, and we're not going to do it now, but I actually think there is a third option, which is if they were to have gone to some sort of conversation that would be facilitated, whether it be by Rav Meir, by somebody who's really an outsider, who could, not be part of the problem.
Who's they, the husband and wife?
Yeah. Well, I mean, because you have a problem here that it's a great exercise of saying, okay, write as a homework assignment, what would you do to help this couple transform their relationship so that this doesn't happen again?
Right.
Because could there have been some sort of sign that she could have said, oh, I'm going to be late, and not show disrespect to Rav Meir, or not show disrespect to her husband, that she could have been able to say? Could the husband have, we have no conversation going on directly where the husband can share what his needs were, what his story was, what was it like sitting in the dark on a Friday night where you're supposed to be together as a family and she's out and she's expecting home, he's worried, sick, you know what I'm saying? So I don't want to demonize him, I don't want to demonize her, and I think that there could have been a really interesting exercise of writing a conversation of if they were to share their stories, get into their stories. But we'll put that aside because we're talking about the dilemma of these options.
But can I disagree a little?
Please.
So this is where you're right not to demonize, and a lot of my language was demonizing the barbarous husband, right? And that's true.
See, I didn't rebuke you on it, but you caught it.
I caught it. However, it's also the case, and Letterock talks about this, I talk about this a lot, is that an ethics-infused commitment to conflict resolution, or Redifa Shalom, is also a commitment to face your values and face the fact that you make choices sometimes. When I was working in a police state, I knew which side that I sided with from an ethical point of view. I knew, and I had to make a choice of where the crimes were being committed. But at the same time, I made a choice to engage everyone positively out of the commitment to Redifa Shalom. It's the same thing here. Yeah. It's not so much, you're absolutely right. You don't say the barbarous husband, that was wrong. But you do say that what he did in barring his wife from the house was an outrageous ethical violation of his marriage contract. Then the question is, what now?
Right.
But you do have to make moral commitments, even though, and Letterock and I talk a lot about the fact that mediation is not about neutrality, it's about trust building.
This is one of the big dilemmas of mediation.
Yeah, well, a lot of people believe it's about neutrality.
The myth of neutrality.
The myth of neutrality, but we believe that actually you have your values, and you state your values, and you know them to yourself when you see something that's wrong. But that doesn't. But you work on yourself to not make it into demonization.
Right.
And that's where so.
Yeah. and I'll also just strengthen the fact that I think that even though there are real ethical questions that come out of this story, I think that the take home is the humility. And how you apply it and where you put it, it doesn't always have to be, just appeasing, but a sense of great humility. And I think that's true often in my personal experience in doing interpersonal mediation, is that it's very tempting to just say the solution. Don't you see? I see. I mean, you have this or that. Right. This is what you need to do. And that humility of saying, they need to work it out. Right. They need to be patient because I need to lower my ego of just saying, this is what you have to do, and allow them. And I think that's something that we should be able to take home. But the question, though, of what happens when they don't get it, when you have that power imbalance. And that question comes up in, I admit, a somewhat obscure source. We're in the world of Chassidut, 18th century, in a well-known Hasidic book, though, Degel Machane Ephraim. And here he talks exactly like what you wrote about how Aaron was a role model. He comes in, he acts out of humility, and then the two parties are supposed to kind of join him in an act of humility and say, oh my God, just like we saw in Kala Rabati. But, he says, there's one question. What happens when one of the sides says, that's exactly the way I should be treated. Aaron, the high priest, should be meeting me. I am more important than he is. And he doesn't get it. And he doesn't have any transformative moment of thinking humbly. The opposite. he starts thinking that he's even more important. At that moment, the Dego Machane Ephraim says, Aaron has to be able to become, and this is very problematic, he becomes a rodef. And here the rodef, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, the other association of where we see that word within rabbinic literature is a pursuer. And one of the things that in Hasidic literature, we're going to see another example in a minute, is so troubled by, why do they call it a rodef shalom? Pursuer. I mean, I heard you once translate rodef as a hunter. A pursuer of peace. It's like, what are we talking about here? And he uses this language, I underline, he says, however, what can be done with some kind of foolish and crude nature person who does not appreciate the value of Aaron lowering himself for his sake, for he thinks to himself that he is worthy that Aaron should speak to him, and then I skip. And behold, for such a person, Aaron would have to change his method and pursue that man, defeat him, humiliate him, show him his shortcomings and his lowly value, in order that afterwards he, Aaron, could make peace between him and his friend, and between his father in heaven. And we were talking about this the other day. I can recall in my one of the advanced mediation trainings that I did, where the woman that was training, that was modeling it, we had a power imbalance, clear power imbalance. A landlord, a different ethnic race, man, older, with a young woman, single, and there was a power imbalance. And there was this moment where the mediator, she just showed the rules of how we're going to talk. And she just kind of threw the book at her, and I said, wow, my God, I thought you're supposed to be like so calm. And she said, well, I wasn't going to let him dominate the conversation and be abusive. And she got him to start saying, okay, you're going to share the time, let her speak, let her listen. But that's one example. But the example goes farther than that, in terms of, well, what point does the Rodef Shalom, does the third party, peacemaker, try to be the neutralizer? Are we just a witness? Are we a neutralizer? And are we, and where is that role? And this is a big, big question facing the Western world in general, the UN. It faces, I brought here this little picture from the time about, I said, how much force can international peacemakers use? I mean, these were dilemmas that happened in the Balkan Civil War, where Clinton made very difficult decisions about using force. So I don't want to necessarily say what's right, because it's all a question of application, I think. But it's a huge dilemma that comes up that I think is addressed here about the Rodef, and it's not only within international peacemaking or in mediation. You see it also. I brought a few sources here from within the Arab Islamic culture, that there are moments where it's documented that certain times when the peacemaker has some strength, not just moral strength, that he's able, there were citations about Hezbollah as peacemakers, because they know that they're not going to want to mess with them, because they have that ability of saying, no, we're going to put the arms down, you're going to put the guns down, and you're going to talk, and we're going to enforce that. So it raises a lot of questions for me about this, and especially the question comes up because of this source, and when we've talked about this source before, I've heard you talk about this Leviticus Rabbah source, and this is a profound statement. I mean, it's just unbelievable, where it says, and here we're on page 43.
It's an incredible statement.
It's an incredible statement.
It's one of the most amazing statements in Judaism.
Yes, where it says three things, but the first thing is, it says that God, based upon the verse in Ecclesiastes, always protects the nirdaf, which is the passive form of that word rodef. That rodef is the pursuer, the nirdaf is the pursued. And he always takes the side of the pursued.
Based on the Ecclesiastes verse.
Based upon the Ecclesiastes verse, he said, and God seeks that which is pursued. And in
a modern idiom, it means that if there's somebody chasing and someone being chased, the God that we believe in is always with the one being chased, which is so radical, because criminals are being chased all the time by the police. So what is it really saying? It's a remarkable statement about the nature of divinity here, of what divine compassion is, of what of the imbalances of the universe, of the asymmetries that Munimar talks about, and what you talked about before, power imbalances.
Right.
At a certain moment, it doesn't matter who's right and wrong, it matters who's weaker.
Right.
In terms of a spiritual evaluation of the situation, which is very intimidating or challenging to the ethics of being in the middle of all of this.
Yes.
I take it to mean that no matter how much you've made a moral decision of who needs to be pursued because they're totally out of line or they're misbehaving, just be careful, because the divine power of the world, whatever that means in your spiritual universe, I have a very expansive notion of what divine power means. The divine power may be against you precisely because you're pursuing somebody, not even if they're guilty.
Right.
And that's a remarkable warning to say, be very, very careful about pursuit and aggression, even when you're in the right.
Right.
It's a real break on confidence about Radifa.
So I'll throw in here, first of all, one of the big dilemmas in peacemaking is that, especially when we get into narrative work, is that often in conflict, interpersonal, intergroup, each side justifies what they're doing because they see themselves as the near duff. They see themselves as one being pursued. Yeah. And that's just, and being able to be able to share with each side how the other one sees himself as the near duff, as the pursued, and how I experience the other one as pursuing me. Getting them out of that thinking is part of the challenge. But I actually wanted to share that I remember coming home Friday night from the synagogue, having seen this source for the first time several years ago, and I took it home like our custom in our house Friday night. Bring up the question, share the midrash with my kids, and we all have a discussion. So I asked the kids to take a vote, and my wife. He said, "Okay, whose side is God on if you have a wicked person chasing after a righteous person?" No brainer, right? And we went through each of these 4 cases until you hit to the most difficult one. A righteous person chasing after a wicked person, whose side is God on? Take a vote. So, whatever, it was the oldest son said, no, it's on the side of the righteous person. He's a righteous person. I think it was the 4-year-old, or the 5-year-old at the time. He said, no, says God's always on the side of the pursuit, of the one who's being pursued. And this was just, and then we had that question, well, what about the police? What about the whole system? There are people that are going to be pursued because they are doing something. And that raises a lot of questions, which is why we brought, and I also have to share that, to note that one of these sources talks about, we were talking about, did we talk about kashrut, about what is allowed to be eaten, what's not allowed to be eaten on tape? No, just in personal conversation. But here it talks about that only animals that were pursued can be offered up on the altar or can be eaten. Animals that are pursuers cannot be. And that's supposed to be kind of a model of saying that's sacred, that's holy, that's chosen.
Going all the way back to Philo, there was a notion that you're internalizing the animal in some ways. And you be very careful not to internalize the pursuers.
Yes.
The
hunters.
To
not become that.
To not become that.
Yeah.
The other interesting model, though, I think what I've seen, an interesting model is the Sucha model that I've seen in these traditional forms of conflict resolution in the Middle East, is that it's a semi-mediation arbitration, where in arbitration the person in the middle is a lot stronger.
Yeah.
In facilitation mediation, it's a lot more of an enabler, and the arbitrator, can. The fact that you can take on that hat when necessary, but also you take it off, and you try to be more of an enabler, is struggling with that question of how strong are you going to be, and how much you're going to make decisions to use that authority, to push back at situations.
Yeah.
I also have to say, in the end, people are going to make decisions on their own about these things, but I was struggling so many cases in all the major religions today about child molestation, and you see you see stories, and you see 2 stories, then you see 3, then you see 5, and you think about the victims as they are, and you say, I know exactly where I am.
Mm-hmm.
Then you see the person in the docket, who clearly, the person who's been arrested.
Oh, okay, sorry.
And you see a person that clearly has serious mental problems with how they were even capable of doing this.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know 100% they're guilty, but let's say all the evidence is really adding up.
Yeah.
In a certain spiritual sense, it's almost as if the Torah and the rabbis are struggling with the fact that yes, there needs to be a protection from criminals.
Mm-hmm.
But if you arrest them, it's one thing. If you start tormenting them in prison, it's another. Then suddenly that's the near death.
Well, that's exactly it's exactly the Minchas Chinuch. That's the next source. The Sefer Chinuch.
Yeah.
That we've also discussed before, and where it's just to read a couple of sentences here. He brings that Vayikra Rabbah piece, the Leviticus Rabbah, about God's always on the side of the pursued, and he says, "And the settlement of the world will endure by the rescue of the weak person from the hand of one who is stronger than he is." And then he says later that even if the pursued person was small and the pursuer was great, then he is in every respect all are duty bound to rescue him, even if by taking the life of the pursuer. But then he says, but you should only try, how does he say it? When does the rule, however, apply? That the rescue may be achieved by taking the life of the pursuer when it is possible for use, for us to rescue him through one of his limbs, through one of the pursuer's limbs. Meaning they're saying, even when you're trying to be a rodef, when you're trying to be a third party, saving that pursued person, trying to emulate God, you have to be so careful. And it's just what you're saying, because if there's a way that you could arrest him, do something, and that's part of the ethical codes that any police has to abide by, that a police can hold somebody and have the law and arrest them. But the moment you just start open firing and shooting, so then he says, then you become the murderer, or in other words, you who are trying to stop a rodef become the rodef.
So
that's the big question about the rodef shalom, about you're trying to pursue peace. Sometimes you have to humble one of the sides. But at what point, when you're trying to humble one of the sides that's abusing the other, do you yourself become more of a rodef, a pursuer, a hunter, than a rodef shalom?
Yeah, and again, it's this fine line that another way to look at it is the difference between justice and revenge. Mm-hmm. In other words, we know that revenge is forbidden, but justice is the highest mitzvah. In a blink of an eye, justice turns into revenge. Mm-hmm. If you protect everybody from somebody who's doing something terrible, that's justice. Yeah. It's also protection of the innocent. The second it becomes cruel, and you even enjoy that unnecessarily cruelty, you have become the very person that you're trying to defend the world against. And that it's like a blink of an eye to become the enemy that you have opposed. Yeah. And this is what we're facing. We're facing this with, I've had to face some terrible choices in recent months with my Syrian partners. Yeah. Because I had to, for years, we had worked so hard. We knew the problems with the police state. We knew what they were doing. Yeah. We also knew good people on all sides. We knew good people in the government trying to do good things. We knew people very high up. But at a certain point, the torture of the children, the murder of the children, the evidence becoming overwhelming, we had to come out more publicly in solidarity with the nonviolent resistors.
Within your death.
And we lost our ability to be arbitrary, to be in between. Yeah. And I knew consciously, and we did it very carefully, and we've really struggled with keeping the messages positive even as we're doing it, because we're under pressure, emotional pressure from people who are deeply wounded, to say things like death to Assad. Right. And I refuse to say that. Right. And other people have refused. Why? It's not because we don't think there's high crimes here. It's because at what point does pursuit of justice and protection of the innocent become revenge or become part of the cycle of violence? This is somebody who's in peacemaking, has to struggle at every moment with self-examination of himself and his partners. Where are we in these ethical dilemmas? How are we making these decisions? Invariably, with my partners, we focus on what we call positive peace building and positive psychology. That no matter how bad things get, focus on your positive goals. What is your goal? Is your goal revenge? Then you've already gone over the edge. Is your goal to protect the innocent? Then keep focused on that. If your goal is to create a society where all people can be in, then keep focused on that and keep your messaging and your aid and the things that you're supporting something that always invites everyone inside. You know, another amazing law in the Torah that I haven't seen enough development of in our field is the idea that if you do attack, that there's always a way out. You know, not surrounding a city on all sides.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Right? So this is very significant.
We discuss that in another part of the courses at Pardes when we do ethical dilemmas of warfare.
Now that's very significant even for peacemakers, because it's an issue of the rules of war in Judaism. I'm talking about the rules of peace, because as you're advising people who are in very difficult situations, one of the things that happens in legal proceedings and many others is that people come to a place of leaving somebody no way out. And that's when people lash out.
Yeah.
But if you're always conscious that no matter what you're arbitrating or what you're facilitating, that people have a way out beyond humiliation, beyond something that is that is destructive to their psyche, their personality, then you're allowing for a nonviolent conclusion. And it takes almost a moral discipline, you know, to stay in that space.
Yeah. In Rob Eisen's book of The Peace and Violence of Judaism, he talks about that as well.
Yeah.
I think he has a piece on that. So let's take a look at a parallel. We'll just briefly talk about the dishonest Rodef Shalom.
Oh, yeah.
Because we saw this, we noted it, that Aaron, in his methodology, was creating this reality, that each side was sorry for how they had behaved, and that succeeded for him. But try doing that at home. I mean, how many times can you actually kind of make up these stories? It's problematic. But we see that that's not a story by itself. We see that throughout classic rabbinic literature, whether it be in the Talmud that says that sometimes God had even changed the truth to make peace between Abraham and Sarah. We see that Maimonides, the great codifier of Jewish law, talks about how that the Torah scholar is allowed to lie for the sake of peace. In certain, that's one of the few exceptions where you're allowed to change the truth. And by the way, we find this in other cultures as well. There's a well-known quote that Abu Nimer brings from the Hadith of al-Bukhari that talks about how when you're pursuing peace, if you need to kind of change the truth, that's okay, because the goal is, it's sort of actually relating to what you're saying. It's kind of, we're going to go along with some things that might be against our truth, but our goal is to get to Shalom. And then we see this kind of other texts, starting with Beit Shammai that disagrees with Beit Hillel about being direct or not direct. There is a text here that I bring from the Yerushalmi that I marked as optional, where there's a debate among scholars in Eretz Yisrael that says, can you reconcile with a lie? Or when you reconcile somebody, what you have to say has to be based upon truth. And all these other kind of laws that push back and try to limit this notion of lying for the sake of peace, saying maybe it's only in certain cases, don't do it too much, But then we get back to this, and I want to just focus our attention on this, this Hasidic literature. And here we're in the Siftei Tzadikim. And he's also talking about this idea of the Rodef. How can it be a Rodef Shalom? Rodef is negative. Rodef isn't good. And peace, he writes, for certainly, the main attribute of peace is founded upon the path of truth. How can there be peace based upon lies, based upon fabrications of reality? And he, similar to the other Hasidic literature that we just saw, basically says Aaron could do it. He knew how to pull this off. By the way, we forgot to mention something very important in the Degel Machane Ephraim. That's the source we've been alluding to a lot about likening the peacemaker to the professional doctor. Mm-hmm. That you could use a certain poison that could kill you and could hurt a lot of people, but a very professional doctor knows how to kind of use that as a medicine to save someone's life and to heal. But don't have everyone just go around trying to be a Rodef Shalom, Rodef as being a pursuer, using certain kind of problematic means to get to this piece of Shalom. So he kind of limits it a great deal. But I think this is another kind of ethical dilemma that comes up.
I think the most important thing to extrapolate from it is to face your ethical dilemmas squarely and to be aware that you're doing a balancing act. It's not always necessarily about lies versus conflict resolution, because there's enormous cultural variability here. Mm-hmm. That at the end of the day, like for example, from a Kantian perspective, the German pietist, European, lying for peace is crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, that violates the essence of his ethical system. Mm-hmm. It's all based on a categorical imperative about truth, mm-hmm. and universalizing that truth. So it's not going to go well if you're having, a conflict where somebody is a German pietist a la Kant, and you're pulling your stuff with telling these white lies in order to get peace. And I've seen this very much in our field, that this doesn't go down well with people from a number of Christian cultures and European mm-hmm. cultures. And so it's not advisable. You have to really adjust to the goals of each situation. What it does teach me, and what I have done personally, is that I like there have been circumstances that are so crazy where people thought things about me, and I didn't disabuse them of that. Like there were moments in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict where people thought I was more important or had more power than I actually did, and I just went with it because it didn't matter, and I didn't say a lie, I didn't say anything, I just pursued it, and they thought, oh, he had a lot of power, and I didn't. And this has happened to me many times, because Americans are perceived as having an exaggerated power in many places in the world. Jews are seen as having a lot of power in many places of the world that in fact we don't have. And so, sometimes you go, well, how much am I going to fight this? And how much am I going to go with the flow of that? So, you face those kind of moments. But I think the real thing I learned from these texts, very important texts, is not an outright lie, which mm-hmm. in most cases is a bad idea. Mm-hmm. But a focus on gleaning the positive mm-hmm. that may not be the total truth, mm-hmm. so that when I'm sitting with when I see such a wounded young woman from Jericho, and I meet her for the first time, and she's never met Jews before, and I say to her, there are hundreds of Jews like the ones here who are committed to justice for you, to peace with you, and she comes back and she says, I'm sorry, I don't believe you, because she just couldn't imagine. But I wanted to emphasize to her that there were people there. I knew that the complexity of it is that people are all over the map on trusting each other, mm-hmm. but I wanted to emphasize to her.
Well, you didn't say all.
I didn't right. say all, exactly. I would never lie like that. Right. But I wanted to emphasize the reality of something and raise that up. And I've done that many times in shuttle diplomacy, where you go with one group and you emphasize something about the other group that they wouldn't likely believe. Right. But you give them the evidence. You tell them your story. You tell them how you grew up, and you emphasize certain things. And you know that there are plenty of people that they are rightly afraid of, but you want to emphasize a certain reality in order to shift consciousness. Right. So I've gone back and forth in these sources. They mm-hmm. did teach me, what they taught me more than anything else is a kind of religious utilitarianism, mm-hmm. a kind of notion that we're focused on goals and we're managing our conflicting ethical priorities of justice, of compassion, of truth, and so that you don't get carried away with one or the other. Some people, I don't want to do that project because it violates X, Y, and Z. Like in my Syria work, the Syrian peace partner I had was a very distinguished lady up there, and in the first stages of it, there were no women in our interfaith conference. It was all the famous the male clerics, but we knew that eventually we would have that better balance, but we didn't push it at first. So we made a utilitarian calculation that yes, equal rights for women was vital, but the better we build trust now, the more we were going to be able to accomplish. That was a utilitarian ethical calculation, and that's what these texts show me, is that you face your ethical dilemmas, but you calculate at each moment in time where you can get the most good and save the most lives and create the least amount of suffering and the most amount of honor, dignity, compassion at that particular moment. And those are very difficult choices, but you try to make them the best you can. I don't know if that's
no. So I mean,
I don't know if that's clear.
That's very clear. I think that sometimes the question of a piece that is based upon a lie versus truth is actually seeking a different type of peace. And I think this goes back to me about, are we trying to resolve the conflict, maybe renegotiate the social hierarchies, rethink whole structure of the society, of the relationship, and really get into the essence of what's going on, what happened, and really work things through in a deep cognitive way? Or is what we're really trying to strive for is kind of this quietness, this harmony? And I think we have to be a little bit critical here while getting inspiration from some of these texts and say, I'm not sure that the conflict resolution model that is so prevalent in Western society of saying we can go in and change things. If we have a problem with the structure, we'll just try to negotiate it and we'll get the people talking to each other. I don't know if that's the business Aaron was always in. I think Aaron was in the harmony business. And I think that that's sometimes a clash between pre-modern and modern or Western kind of cultures, and I think it's important to be aware of that. For me, the inspiration that I get out of it is not only about saying positive things about other people, which I think is a great take home, but I think it's also sometimes, somebody's really angry and I'm sitting and listening to them. If I say every single word that they say and the way they say it, I'm just going to blow things up. But there's a way of sitting with that person and kind of helping them reframe. And transform the language and say it in a kind of a positive way. The same we do in mediation a lot is we want to kind of say the story back so that it sounds so it's still very authentic and true, but it's really reflecting upon the needs and the emotions and the narrative of that person in a safe way that the other person will be able to hear it. And I think that's what Aaron's really doing.
It's a very good example because reframing could be seen by many people as lying.
Because you're changing something.
You're changing. And
but you're staying true to the essence of what the person needs to say.
You try your best to do that.
So I think we should just, I don't want to conclude by reflecting back a little bit about where we started in this journey of pursuing to become a pursuer of peace. And we started with the Aaron, the high priest, as the ideal model. We talked about of a Rodef Shalom. We talked about how this has been a model that was actually copied and practiced in Jewish history, which is an inspiration to kind of bring that back. And we talked about who he pursued peace between, and what does it mean to love peace, pursue peace, and all those things. And then we talked about different identities, different methods, moving on to destructive conflict and constructive conflict, for the sake of heaven, not for the sake of heaven, how we can transform those and not just say this is this or that's that, but we can move things and how we move things. We can move things through sometimes doing actions, these unilateral gestures of helping another one. That creates this cognitive dissonance, that creates the transformation of self and other. And then not only through actions, but we also talked about how sometimes in communication, which is also an act of how we're talking with each other, how we can transform the conversation. And we talked about the Road of Shalom communication agreement, and then coming into these kind of ethical dilemmas that we have to be aware of. We're dealing with real life situations, And in real life, there are going to be power imbalances. There are going to be ethical issues. I want to conclude with the way many tractates of rabbinic literature are concluded, with this way the morning prayer service is concluded, and most importantly, my closing line of my signature of my email, which is Talmidei Chachamim Rabim Shalom Be'olam, which is Torah scholars increase peace in the world. And I like to say one of the moments, the transformative moments, when people say, how did I get into this? I say, because I remember as an 18-year-old learning in yeshiva, somebody came up to me in synagogue one day and they say, where do you know that the Siddur, the prayer book, has a sense of humor? And I don't know, they say, because it says Torah scholars increase peace in the world. That's pretty funny, huh? And I took that so personally, as like a personal hit to me studying Torah, that it was this kind of journey of saying, all right, maybe it's not always a reality. Maybe there's not always that link, that direct connection between learning texts, learning Torah, and becoming and increasing peace in the world. But I also don't think it's a joke, and I like to think sometimes that it might be a prayer. May Torah scholars increase peace in the world? But I think it also is a commandment. Torah scholars increase peace in the world. It's the responsibility to learn text and to ensure that religion, Judaism, is used and continues to increase peace in the world.
Can I tell you a story about this?
Yes.
And I'll give you my own Dvar Torah.
Yeah.
It was in one of those moments in Syria where I was a professor of conflict resolution, and I had a very deep connection with this Shiite Islamic scholar. And at one point I felt I trusted him, and it was very early on, and I didn't know who to trust about my identity. And
as a Jew,
as a rabbi.
As a rabbi.
Yeah. I was professor of conflict resolution often. Later on, I would be also a rabbi, and that was fine.
Right.
But this was very early, 2003, right. And I was in his apartment, and I was about to leave, and I said, and we had a very emotional connection. At one point, the Christian translator was translating between this Muslim and this Jew, and I was saying in English what he was saying in Arabic at exactly the same moment about a spiritual text. Mm-hmm. So the Christian started to cry because it was such an extraordinary Abrahamic moment. So I'm about to leave, and I said, I turned around to him, I said, Ana Chacham. I said, I'm a rabbi. Mm-hmm. And he went like this, there is no peace without the Chacham. Mm. He quoted from the Talmud. Mm. It just blew me away because somewhere buried in that old relationships between rabbis and imams, there was an idea that the Chacham had played a critical role in mediation. And indeed, I found out after that this used to happen all the time between rabbis in the Middle East and imams on arbitration and negotiation of deals. So that was amazing to me about Talmidei Chachamim Rabim Shalom. I heard it from a Shiite leader.
Yeah.
The second thing is that, and this may be very radical for some people, Talmidei Chachamim to me is
Torah scholars.
The translation is not Torah scholars.
Okay.
The translation is students of wisdom. Mm. It's the students of the wise, literally, students of the wise, and students of many wise people. Mm-hmm. And I think that the key to that, of why students of many wise people and wise traditions increase peace in the world, is precisely the diversity of becoming a student of many wisdom traditions, many wise people. Because in that multiplicity and diversity, but the commonness of the search for wisdom is the creation of peace. Mm-hmm. So
who is wise? He who learns from all.
Yeah, Ezehu Chacham, Halomed Mikol Adam. Who is
Kol
wise?
Adam, all people.
Mikol Adam, from all human beings. It's not Jews. It says Adam,
right?
From all human beings. And this is also, I'll never forget what I heard from Rabbi Soloveitchik when we were walking up to synagogue once, when I was a kid, and I asked him, what is Torah Shabbal Peh?
What is the oral tradition?
What is the oral tradition of Torah, which usually we think of as the Talmud and the Mishnah? I thought he was going to say the Talmud includes the Mishnah. This is where Midrash Halacha fits in. He says it's the human mind at hard work. said, oh my God, that is so, it's such a powerful universal statement, is that wisdom from everywhere is becomes part of Torah. In that sense, you don't have to think about our problems with rabbis today, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. It's not about rabbis. It's about students of wisdom who increased peace in the world. And that, sometimes it's a rabbi, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's somebody very simple, sometimes it's for somebody very educated. But those are the people that increase peace in the world. And I that's how I live with that text, and
Okay.
it's I guess it's my faith.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Good.
What time is it?
Did I ever tell you that?